the same. So I happen to do the same. So there is my little transfer. Just for size wise, this is 9 by 12 cold press watercolor paper. I did a little carbon paper transfer. I just printed it out and taped it down and just went over the lines that I thought would be helpful to get started with. And I think a lot of this, we were kind of talking about on Thursday night, Michelle and I were talking about it a little bit, but a lot of this will kind of help be defined when we start to block in the fur. So if you feel like your kitty looks a little silly right now without that little value structure in there, it's okay. Just a little in the face, when we start to get some definition in there. So I was thinking I kind of want to try a fairly limited color palette today. I was looking at the colors, there's a lot of color to look at. To me, the part that I really love about this particular piece is kind of that glow feeling you get, the warmth that's on the fur, I think is really fun. And that background, I think, is kind of cool and fun to try with acrylic painting. It's similar to a bokeh style background where things are just kind of blurred and the main subject is in focus. So there's a lot of ways to interpret that without making it look exactly like this, but giving a suggestion of it. So that's typically my goal, because it's not a photograph I'm creating, it's a painting. So mine can look like a painting, that's okay. But color wise, I'm going to share with you what I pulled for colors. And then if you have questions or anything like that, let me know. But I think color is very subjective with what you want to do. I don't think you have to follow mine exactly. I just sometimes like the idea of using less colors so it's not so overwhelming, especially when we're looking at something with a lot of color in it. So I pulled magenta as my red. A lot of y'all know I love magenta. So my red is actually going to be a magenta. You could use a red instead, but I like the coolness of this. And when I look at the piece, even though I say it's warmth, when I really look close to me, it kind of feels maybe a slight bit cooler, but you could play with that. Then I pulled a cad yellow light, a cobalt blue. So these are my cool primaries. And then I have a white. And instead of a black, I pulled raw umber. You could also use burnt umber if you don't have raw umber. Burnt umber, in my opinion, is just a bit warmer. Raw umber is just a little bit more neutral. So that's why I pulled this to use with this particular piece to get some of those dark values. I can actually mix blue and brown together to make a darker value. Now, if I decide like in the eye, for example, or parts on the butterfly, or I might add a little touch of black. I'll see kind of how it goes. But these are the colors I was thinking to get started with for my kind of basic color palette. Essentially, I'm using a primary color palette with a white and a dark neutral. But does anyone have any questions about colors or subbing colors or anything like that before we get going? All right. Well, as always, and we've got a small enough group and all of you've been here, so you kind of know how it goes. So if you have questions, comments as we go along, let me know. But here's kind of my thought process of what I wanted to do. I do want to start with a wash for sure. I'm thinking maybe making a slightly orangish wash, so magenta with a little yellow. And then I wanted to paint my background first. And here's why I want to paint my background first. A lot of times I like to work back to front, but if we look at the fur of the cat, in my opinion, goes over top of the background. And if we paint that fur first and get all those soft edges, oh my goodness, could you imagine cutting in that background, how frustrating that would be? So that's my thought, is we get all these light, soft edges to me that cover the background. So I wanted to do background first, and kind of see if we can get through that today. And then if we can, then we can start blocking in within the cat. Although I do think you could totally like paint the butterfly first if you wanted to, focus on that and then build the cat around. But we can kind of go from there. But I definitely think background first with how these soft edges are pretty much around the entire cat.
Jennifer,
Yeah.
If I wanted to mix a magenta, what colors would I put together?
If you don't have an actual magenta, you can try mixing up a purple first. So a blue and a red.
Okay,
And after you do that, you can kind of add just like a little bit more red into it.
okay.
Do you guys hear that loud noise?
I heard something.
I just yelled at my cat, but I was mic'd,
I don't
muted.
know, there's like this weird loud noise, and it felt like it was coming from my house. So
That's
I
weird.
didn't know if anyone heard that. It almost sounded like a horn of a ship, but like muted. Weird. I don't know.
Oh, that's weird.
Like, am I going crazy over here?
I don't think I sound like a boat horn.
No, I don't think it was any of you because I feel like I felt it.
Oh, that's weird.
Weird. Maybe
that
my
is
neighbor's
weird.
doing something.
Yeah.
All the houses kind of around me are fairly close proximity. So sometimes what someone's doing over there feels like it's happening here.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay, moving on. So yeah, with the magenta, you won't get as pinky. It'll kind of be a little bit more like red violety, but it'll still be a really pretty color that I think could work. The other option is you could do kind of a red orange. Again, it's not as pinky, but it could be a really pretty color. So taking a red with a little bit of yellow, just a smidge of yellow. So you're not going full orange, but you're just bringing a little yellow into it. So couple options, but you can, of course, do any color wash you want, really, or you can forego it. But I personally, especially with white fur, find it extremely challenging to paint white on white. I think that's hard. It's hard to see, in my opinion. Some people do it though. It's a matter of preference. So I've got a little yellow, little magenta there. And I know I'll use those colors up. I don't need all of that for my wash, but I'll be using it anyway. And I'm using just a piece of palette paper. I've got some old paint over there, but I always try to use up every little bit of it that I can. So what I do, I've got this kind of bigger flat brush. I would say use kind of the biggest brush you have for a wash, but if you don't have a super big brush, I do something like this even for a wash, depending on what you have on hand. But it doesn't matter if you see texture in the wash, really. And some people like it smooth, but it doesn't matter too much. But what I'm going to do is dip my brush in some water. I'm just going to use water for my wash. I'm using watercolor paper. If I use canvas, oftentimes I like to use medium, like matte medium, glazing medium, something like that, just so the binder doesn't break down. But with the watercolor paper, usually because it just soaks in, I don't mind too much. So I'm just making my wash color. Like I said, I'm mixing some magenta with some yellow to kind of create an orangish color wash and just kind of letting it mix up right there. And then what I want to do is just take water, and here's my pro tip with a wash. People, depending on how you've transferred or drawn, you might have dark lines, you might have light lines. Carbon paper usually gets you fairly darkish lines, but if you did a pencil transfer or you freehand drew this, you might have light lines. So I always test a spot, like I don't put this across the face in case I wash it away. I always test a safe spot just to make sure it is in fact see-through. Because this isn't too big of a deal if I lose that. I could just draw that back in. But if I go over the face and the butterfly, I'm going to be a bit annoyed if I lose it. So I always test a spot. Once I know I'm good, then I just take water and start spreading. Once again, it's okay if you get color variation, like I had a little color not quite mix as much as I thought it was going to, but that's okay. I'm just going to mix that in. And honestly, you could have a little bit of a multicolor wash if you want to. That's okay. Some people have one color in one area and pop another color in another area. It doesn't matter. It's just usually doing one color is fast. But some people want to spend more time. A while back, we did that Allie Kay inspired painting. And that one, we did multicolor washes. I know some of y'all were here for that. Not everyone was, but The idea is you could have one area be a little bit more pink, one area be a little bit more orangey, a little bit more yellow, whatever you want. It's almost like a watercolor painting, right? You could do like wet on wet and just drop different colors in. And why would you want to do that? Well, if you want to let this wash poke through it all, that can be a really fun way to have other colors poke through. So after the wash, I want to think about this background. Now, when I look at the background, I'm just going to talk about the background a little bit while this dries. I see, of course, we've got some orange going up here. We have some kind of dark, could maybe be black or just a dark neutral kind of coming back in here. We even get little bits of mixes of colors when you get in there. It's almost kind of yellow greenish. A lot of glazing could be done to kind of capture a lot of this color. It just depends how detailed you want to get with it. I might not make mine super detailed, but we get blues back there, blue down here, of course, some more neutral. So I was just thinking about on my palette, getting some of these colors ready for the background while this is drying up. So I know I'm definitely gonna want some of this blue. And I actually happen to have like a blue that would be probably pretty close to perfect for that, this light blue permanent. So I could switch to this instead of my cobalt blue, to be honest with you. I could make a switch. And honestly, there isn't a lot of dark blue in it. So it would just save me mixing a bunch of white to my cobalt if I use this. So I might switch this out for my cobalt since I haven't even used any of it yet and have this be my new blue. Because basically this is just blue with white already mixed into it. So I can mix more white to get it lighter. If you do not have a light blue like this, you can just take a dot of whatever blue you have and add some white to it. And if it's not the exact same blue, it's okay. It doesn't have to be. Just kind of made a little game time decision when that blue caught my eye, and I was like, actually, it's pretty darn close. And then I said my neutral, I'm going to use a raw umber. Actually, I take that back. That's what I might need my cobalt blue for, is to darken my raw umber. So actually, I might take.
I've been using a lot of raw umber lately. It comes in handy.
Raw umber is a great paint to have. It really is.
When I first started, I thought, when am I ever going to use this hideous color? But it's really, now that I understand color a little better, like you said, I was like, do you want to get rid of your blue, Jen? You might want to put it in your
Yeah, I didn't even think about that till I got to my raw umber. And then I was like, oh yeah, I want it to darken.
Yeah.
That's okay. I actually put a little phthalo blue on my palette instead of cobalt since I'm using it just to darken.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, I don't need much of it. So those are my colors kind of for the background. I already have some magenta and yellow for some of those oranges. So that's pretty much my color scheme. The thing I want to talk about with blending, and I know a lot of you know this already because you've been doing some acrylic painting for a while, but I always think it's nice to refresh some of these skills for myself too. But the biggest thing you want to think about with these edges to get a soft edge is the idea of wet on wet. So with acrylics, and this is true of gouache as well, if you're using gouache, and essentially oil, it's just oil doesn't take so long to dry, but while the paint is wet, you can put multiple colors next to each other and soften the edges between them. The reason that's important is because when we look at the edges in the background here, they are soft. There's not a harsh line. Yes, there is a color value, which is typically reads as contrast, and sometimes that makes us read it as a harder line. But when we look close, even though there's not like an ombre transition gradient between the two values, there is a soft edge between them. So that's what you want to think about. In order to get that soft edge, it's either helpful to have both colors wet, or you could use a scumbling method as well. Scumbling is when you are using your brush in circular motions, and typically your brush is drier and you have just a little bit of paint on it. So
Mm.
I'll kind of be talking about both methods. Now you can do scumbling in different ways. Sometimes I do put water in my brush when I'm scumbling. It just depends what I'm doing. But the traditional kind of way to do it is no water, little bit of paint, just really soft kind of dry brush, which gives you a delicate, soft edge. So as far as color goes, I think I'm going to start with some darks. And I think I'm going to go ahead and start with some of the darks kind of going to the left of the butterfly and the cat's head there a little bit and start blocking in those areas first. Then I'm going to start bringing in some of the blue. For brushes, I pulled around in a flat, a number 8 and a number 6, and I might, change between different brushes, but that's what I'm going to start with. I'm going to take some of my raw umber, pull it out, and I'm going to add just a touch of my phthalo blue. And just mix that up really good. And that's going to get me my darkest dark that I'm using. Again, I'm not using black. If I was going to use black, I could use some black for this part. And you can always add a touch of brown to your black or a touch of blue if you want to soften it up a little bit. Then what I'm going to do with my flat brush, this is still a little wet right here, but and FYI, you can technically paint on top of a wet wash. I know some people that enjoy that. It can kind of blend your first layer in with the wash a little bit, but some people prefer it to dry. I typically do let it dry. The part over here that I'm gonna paint is dry. So I'm going to go ahead and start with that. And I'm just going to take my flat brush and I'm going to start blocking in my dark. Again, that is raw umber mixed with a little phthalo blue is what I'm using. But you could mix burnt umber with some blue. You could, maybe you have a different kind of brown. There's like Van Dyke brown that could work well with a blue, or maybe you just have a black that you want to use. That's fine too. But what I'm going to do is just kind of pull the paint right now and just move my brush in some different directions just to kind of soften it and smooth it out. I'm not worrying about the edges too much because I'm going to bring some other paint in there, but I'm just kind of loosely looking where is it darker and blocking in those spots. This part, when you first get started, always feels a little strange in my opinion. It's just kind of like, oh man, what's it going to turn out like? But as we start building and adding on from here, it's only going to start developing. So I'm just kind of noticing how that dark cuts in close to the cat and the butterfly. And this is why, again, I wanted to do the background first so I can get that fur going over top of the background. And I'm just going to keep pulling in a little bit more blue into my burnt umber. Raw umber. I personally don't mind too much if my color shifts slightly, especially with a background like this where it's not solid anyway. And this is my painting interpretation of it. It does not need to be exact. But I'm just going to use my brush and kind of take the corner and just cut in between the butterfly wings a little bit there. And just kind of look at where the blue starts to come in, where that shape of blue is, so I can leave that blank. And then as I'm going, I'm just mixing up a little bit more paint. And then up at the top, I noticed there's a couple other little areas of dark kind of coming through here. So I'm just going to go ahead and block those in as well and kind of leave gaps for where the orangish and other values are kind of at. Just going to kind of pull that out and just kind of loosely look at these shapes. They are not exact, but I don't need them to be either. And then where else do I see some of this darker kind of value? I'm just going to use my brush to kind of loosely paint some shapes in here. And I'm just looking at the picture to determine where this is going to be. And it's not exact. It's my loose interpretation. Yours might look a little different. That's okay. Now this little spot up behind the cat's back that I'm painting here actually looks a little lighter brown. So I'm going to take a little of just the raw umber and add that in.
Okay, I love you. You're welcome.
Take care of the house next. Come here. We take care of the towels, okay? You're the man of the house.
We mute.
There you go. Sorry, just figuring it out. I had it go on full screen and the buttons were in a different spot, so it took me a minute. Okay, so just kind of blocking in a few areas. There's a few areas down here where it's a little darker, but it looks a little bit more brownish to me. It gets a little bit lighter. So I'm going to start using less blue and more raw umber as I start to kind of pull this down. And again, the color is not exact, but that's fine. I don't need it to be. So I'm just going to pull in some of that raw umber and just, again, kind of looking at these shapes. It's lighter inside this shape here. So I'm going to leave that blank just for a minute because I'm going to add a little white into that spot. And then I'm going to just pull one more little row of this down. And I kind of notice it goes up to the cat. And then below that, it's kind of blue, a bluish color. Now at the very bottom, though, it looks kind of dark again. So I kind of like that idea for grounding, maybe putting one little dark strip here at the bottom. I'm just gonna, I happen to tape mine with some washi tape that I had. So I get a little clean edge and I just then take my brush right to that edge and just kind of pull that across. And I do want to point something out. If we look at the bottom, do you see how some of the blue goes between the fur here? And so does that dark line. Now that's if you want to get real specific, but that's what's happening. You know, that is what I see. So if I wanted to, I could even pull that line just a little into where the cat is to have some of that be that fur spot if I want. I also notice there's kind of a dark little edge that actually comes into where some of the blue is that I'm going to just pull in a little spot right there. And I think about direction of my brush, like if something feels horizontal to me, I like to pull my brush in that direction. If it feels vertical to me or at a diagonal, I just try to follow the direction of the stroke and I just try to interpret that to the best of my ability. Sometimes like fur, it's a little bit more obvious. These shapes in the background, sometimes it's a little hard to interpret. So I just kind of guess and do my best kind of interpretation. So I want to fill these little gaps where it's a little bit lighter now. So I'm going to add just a touch of white, which with my mixture, honestly, is going to get me a little bit more of a gray than brown, but that's fine for me. A little bit of a gray will be fine. I'm always someone who says, I don't care if my colors match exactly. That's usually not my goal. So I do have a little bit of kind of a lighter gray. Actually, it's a fairly dark gray still, but it's a little bit lighter than the value up here that I'm pulling in. And all I did to get this color was I took my dark value and just added a bit of white to it. So again, it does read as a bit of gray, but honestly, it kind of reads gray in the picture too, like a gray brown. This is the type of time where I don't, I can decide if I want my wash to poke through. The reason sometimes a wash is nice is if you have gaps between your brush strokes, the wash pokes through. So you have a bit of a color, not white poking through, can make it feel a little bit more finished. So just something to keep in mind as you're painting. It's okay if the wash pokes through. I just would encourage you, if you do let it poke through in multiple places. So it looks unified rather than just one spot. And then as I get up to the edge of the cat, by the way, I just kind of take my brush and just let it kind of softly kind of run into the edge of the cat with the understanding that I will be painting some fur back over top of that to fix these edges. As long as it kind of mimics the edge of the cat, that's fine. It doesn't matter if I accidentally get a little bit of paint in there. And I'm going to go ahead and just pause and turn on a little light background music for us here. And as always, just because I can't hear it on the other end, if you feel like it's too loud or you can't hear it, you want it louder, you just let me know. I've got a few more little areas for this gray color. I just want to put a little bit of it in this spot. And with these little backgrounds, I kind of talked about this already, but I do not mind color variation. So sometimes I might grab a little extra white and work it in. Because this is where the wet on wet comes in play. If you are painting an area and it's wet paint, you can take another color and allow it to mix right in. And sometimes, you know, you might not end up needing to rework edges because of how you apply it. It might look soft, it might just kind of work, but you can always go back in and soften edges. I'm going to bring in another little strip between these two gray areas I painted just because I feel like I lost that a little bit. Just cleaning my brush off, grabbing my dark again, which is my blue plus my raw umber. And then I'm going to just bring a little bit more of that in here just to kind of define that space. Kind of letting it mix and blend. You can put more layers on if it's poking through and you want it to be a little bit darker or more layered. Remember, acrylic paint builds up. So if you put one layer down, you can always go back over top of it just to kind of build up the color a bit more. And honestly, I think backgrounds are an important component to a painting. You know, I know sometimes people will leave backgrounds white and just paint something simple or have a simple background, but backgrounds can really help, you know, make a painting feel unified or make the subject matter pop. So, you know, I think it's okay to spend a little time here. That's what I'm getting at. It's okay to spend a little time and rework it or add more layers until you're satisfied. Now I'll talk about some of these other colors in just a moment here. Maybe you're already on to some of them. And I'll come back for some of the darks because there's more dark up here that I actually kind of abandoned and went elsewhere. I'm just adding in a bit more up top here. Just kind of in a few areas. Again, it is not exact, but just getting a little bit of that dark value in there. All right, next I think I want the blue. I think I'm going to add in the blue just because I feel like the blue dominates a little bit more than the orange. So I feel like if I get the blue and kind of get structure in there, then I'll have that little space kind of for the orange. And I'll talk a little bit about that orange too, because there is other colors mixed in there. So there's some ways you can kind of play around with that. I'm going to clean off my brush. And then I'm going to grab some of the blue. And I think what I'm going to do is have the blue straight from the tube be the darkest version of this blue. And then I'm just going to start blocking in where I see some of the blue. But then what I can do is add bits of white to it where it's a bit lighter. And honestly, if I do want to darken my blue, I can always add a bit of my phthalo blue to it as well. And if you didn't have a lighter blue to use, or you just want to use one blue, again, you can always add a little white to it to start to darken it. And then I'm just going to start blocking in. That's what I refer to when I just kind of put the basic areas of color down. And many artists refer to it as blocking in, is when you're just getting those big blocks of color in. It's before all the little detail stuff. The detail stuff will come back to. So I like the little whiskers. It's like I didn't even bother to paint those in. I'm going to be painting stuff behind that. Whiskers sit on top. So, you know, that's some of the last stuff I'll think about. Actually going to add just a touch of phthalo blue just up at the top where it's a little darker. And a few areas down here. Since it's already in my painting, figure why not. And again, I can take a little white and make it even lighter blue for the areas where it looks a little lighter. And again, the paint texture is always going to look a little different than a photograph, but that's fine. That's part of the joy of this, in my opinion, is you get to interpret the texture how you want to. So here I'm just going to work a little white into it. And again, the paint is wet, so it's just blending right in. If it was dry, it would sit more on top. And then again, swirling your brush, that's referred to as scumbling. And swirling your brush is just a way to get softer application and less visible brush stroke. Or, I mean, you still can see some brush stroke, but you see less directional line going in one particular direction. And then once again, we talked about this, how the blue kind of pops underneath the fur a little bit. I like that. So I want to bring in the blue a little bit underneath, just like I did before. And I have some kind of directional feeling strokes here. So again, this is where I could just kind of come in and swirl. And swirling it just kind of makes it feel a little softer. Just getting a little of that variation in there. Again, it's not exact. Now, one thing I could do if I want to get a little blue feeling over this little spot, I can water down some paint. I could also use some glazing medium for this, but you can do a little glaze on top where you take some watered down paint. Sometimes it'll take a minute to kind of really show up until it dries, but you can kind of you still have that dark show through, but just give a little bit of that feeling on top. So I might glaze another layer when that dries because that's pretty faint. But while that's drying, I can go up to another area where I see some blue. I love it because you even see like a little blue reflected in the fur of the cat too. So we'll come back to the blue when we're doing the cat. So if you mixed a blue, you might want to remember your recipe because you might want that blue again for the actual cat. I notice it's a little lighter in some areas, so I can mix some white in there. Just kind of swirling it around just gives a little bit of a softer application. And then I notice it's kind of whitish, and there's a lot of little flecks of color, especially in this upper area. There's a lot. So I probably will be simplifying it slightly, but I'll talk about, some glazing ideas and things you can do if you want to get more of that color in there. I'm switching to a little bit of a smaller brush, my round number 6, just for when I bring the blue in over by the butterfly. Again, you can always add a little water in your brush too, or a little medium just for fluidity or to kind of help it feel a little softer. I just kind of use the tip of the round brush just to kind of cut into these smaller areas. And then I notice it starts to get a little lighter in some spots. So I'll grab some white and start working that into. But first, I do see a couple more spots of blue. So while I have some blue on my brush, I'm going to block that in first. This is, for those of you who did the owl, honestly, it's not that different than the owl background. It's just the shapes are kind of different, but the idea of it kind of being blurred. And for those of you who weren't here for the owl, I'll show it to you in a minute. I don't know if it's fully necessarily finished, but you can just kind of see that soft effect around it with those softer edges. So we're kind of going for something a little bit similar to that. Again, this part gets tricky. There's a lot of little subtle differences. So what I do is I just kind of like to loosely squint, kind of loosely glance up, and just try to lightly interpret what I see. Like I actually pulled this down maybe a little bit too far, but you know what? That's fine. Just gonna have it be part of it. I'm gonna bring in some of the other blue areas that I see. And they're not exact, but I don't think that matters. This time I'm adding a little white because I notice it gets a lot lighter in some spots. And I still have a little bit of water mixed into my brush here, just so it's, again, a little bit of a softer application. Yeah, my shapes and things are definitely not the exact size or exactly right. So one thing I want to zoom in on a little bit just to show you is this little spot here. I mean, really, you could achieve that exact look with paint. You definitely could. It might take a little while just because it's a lot of soft little blending and it's like, how much time do you want to spend? But to me, if I pull a little bit of my kind of white over here, let that dry, after I get my orange color mixed, I'm going to bring a little of that orange through here. And this could be, like, this is kind of a tricky-ish color here. Because really, it's almost kind of a gray. Like if you made a gray by mixing blue plus orange and adding white, you would get something kind of like this. It's like a chromatic neutral, basically made from two complements. And you have those two complements in this painting. Orange and blue are complement, across from each other on the color wheel. So if you take a bit of your orange, a bit of your blue, mix it together, then add a little white, you will most likely get something kind of grayish like this. If you don't, it might be kind of brownish. Sometimes it ends up more brownish. But a lot of times that's how you get those little subtle grays. It's not like black plus white usually for that type of gray because there's color in it. So usually, let me put my color wheel out really quick. Because there's multiple combinations. We just happen to be using blue and orange. That's why I say blue and orange. So if you look at the colors across from each other on the color wheel, that's how you mix those neutrals. We could do the same thing with our red and our green, or our violet and our yellow. But again, blue and orange are dominant in this painting, in my opinion. So that's the recipe I would use. But before I get to that, I have a little bit more kind of that bluish white I want to pop in. And then I'm going to try making a little bit of those kind of orange and then get to that neutral color. I have a few more little spots. Okay, I think I'm gonna make kind of the gray first, to be honest with you, before I get into painting the orange, but I'll have to make my orange first. So let's see how this is gonna go. As different colors, of course, react differently depending on different factors. They're warm and cool and things like that. So making my orange, and I just used my yellow and my magenta just like I did when I did my background. It's not the exact orange that's in this particular one. This orange is a little, actually, as I'm looking at, it's a little bit warmer. But I wanted to play with my cool colors. All right, so I'm gonna pull some of that orange out. I'm gonna add a little bit of my blue. Let's see what I get. Might be getting a bit of a I'm adding a bit of blue. I'm getting kind of this muted orangish color, and then I'm going to add a little white to it. It's a little bit of almost more of a tannish that I got than a gray. I'm gonna go ahead and just use it because it's my colors together. So I feel like it's gonna work. But if you wanted to get more of a gray, you definitely could. You could do your, if you did raw umber and blue plus white, that gets you a nice gray. That's again kind of like the gray I was using here. I'm gonna use a bit of this mixture that I made kind of for this spot, and then I might bring some of my gray into it. So again, what I did is orange plus my light blue plus white. And I got this kind of light color that I'm using for those little, again, those little bokeh circle bits that we see there. And I did paint again some of my dark area kind of in the wrong spot, but that's fine. I'm just gonna let it be part of it, and I'm just gonna paint it around there anyway. Then I noticed there's spots where it's a little lighter in there, so I add in a little bit of my white paint, and I can just do some mixing right on my palette, or sorry, on my painting itself. And I'm gonna get the actual orange in there in a minute. So I still like how there's that pop of orange. I just want to get that kind of neutral part first. And for the rest of the gray, I am going to return to what I did over here. I want it to feel a little bit more gray. So I'm going to mix my my raw umber. I always like to call raw umber burnt umber just because I typically use burnt umber a little bit more. But there's raw umber, raw sienna, burnt sienna. You got all these neutrals. So mixing a little bit more of that up. Again, it's raw umber plus I did phthalo blue plus white gives me a nice gray. And again, I already used some of that gray, so it'll be balanced having some of that in here. I'm adding a little bit more white to it. And then I'm gonna start kind of blocking it in. I added a little water to my brush just to kind of help it flow. And I'm gonna fill in kind of a bigger gray spot than what it actually is just because my shapes are a little off. Then I can always work that gray into this kind of darker area. I want to add a little bit more raw umber on my brush and just kind of tap it into the wet paint. I can get a little bit of a gradation there. The same as before, I just kind of bring it up to the edge of the cat just a little bit. And a little water in my brush just to, again, help it flow as I'm pulling around the cat's ear there. So my spot through here is just, it's not going to be quite the same as what it looks like on the picture, but that, again, that is fine. But what I'm going to do is actually work in a little bit of that kind of other neutral I made. It's like the tan kind of neutral and my gray neutral I made. I'm just gonna kind of let them work into each other a little bit, just to get a little bit of a, kind of hold that up so you can see it. Just a little bit of difference in color, because again, when I look close, it is not a solid color there. There's just little subtleties everywhere, which again is hard to, unless you want to spend 3 days on the background alone, it can be hard to get it exact. So I'm into suggesting it. Again, just move my brush around in different directions. I like to sometimes do that in an area where it doesn't feel so directional. I'll just pull my brush in different directions just so the paint isn't sending your eye a certain way. And I did mix again a little of my neutral that I made with my orange and my blue, just white, mixing that into the gray. And then I'm going to take a bit of my gray actually and bring it into these areas just slightly. Kind of darken just a few areas. Again, if your paint is a little too harsh, you could always try a little water on it. But again, you could make this more painterly too. It doesn't have to, again, look like a photograph. And I can actually use some of this paint just to kind of fix shape through here. All right, so I'm going to get a little orange going here in just a minute. We're getting close on this background. Good timing too, because that'll give us two sessions to work on the cat, which I think will be great. But what I'm going to do up here is just pull a little gray. I see almost like a little squarish shape and some other little shapes kind of some gray through here. So I'm just going to lightly add a little bit in just to kind of help fill up some of this negative space. It's just kind of dark and different kind of shapes and shadows. And so if I just kind of block in some of that dark, then I'll leave a few little spots for the orange. I'm just going to kind of fill in some of this negative space that I've left open, just again with some of my darker neutrals that I've made. The other thing I'll say about the background, sometimes I'll kind of block in loosely, do the cat, and then if there's some areas in the background I want to add to, I can. But I think it's fun to watch how it transforms when we'll paint the cat and how that background will all of a sudden push back. Because it's the painted thing right now, it feels dominant. But it won't once we shift that around. I'm just going to pop a little bit more of the darker blue into here. In this little area, mine looks a little different than it actually is. So I'm just going to kind of make it up. Just bring in a little bit of blue. Just kind of paint a little blue in there and just kind of soften it up a little bit. This is too where you could take a little bit of dry brush. This is scumbling, where you can just take your edge and you just kind of go over, swirling, and you can just kind of bring a little bit of a softer transition to your edges. So if you ever want to do this too around any of your finished dry spots, you can. Kind of swirl it. You do need a little light paint on your brush. You don't need a lot, but it is one way to kind of soften those edges back out if you have a harsh line or you don't like your edge or whatever the reason might be. But I will say, just because this doesn't have harsh edges doesn't mean you can't change it, because there's a lot of fun ways to interpret. Or to stylize something. Yeah, just some kind of light. And I'll just kind of let that dry, see what it looks like. And if I want to make some changes, I can make some changes. I might make that a little darker later, but I want to get to this orange. I figure we can do more sharing toward the end, but you know, if anyone does want, you know, to share or have any wants advice or anything, you know, we can definitely do that too. But my thought is we can share more as we get going with it. I'm gonna mix up my orange. Again, my orange isn't gonna be quite as warm as the orange on there just because I'm using a bit of a cooler yellow and my magenta, which is a cooler red. But what I'm going to start doing, and by the way, there is multiple ways you can do this. Some people might even like to lightly lay some dark, then put the orange on. I'm going to try some orange, and then maybe if it's too bright, I can glaze and dark on top of it. It does look like there's kind of some darker areas mixed into there, but like I can bring the light on top of the dark slightly and have it kind of poke through. I can do the same thing with the dark and the light. I can put dark paint over top of light paint just to give it a bit of that look. The way the orange kind of goes over the dark, if you kind of layer that, you'll get a little bit of the effect of what's happening in the picture. And like I said, I'm going to water down some of the dark and then lay that back on top just to kind of soften that in. And again, mine's not exact. The shape is a little different. That's okay. So I'm also going to kind of water down. I'm going to let this dry a minute. I'm going to water down a little bit of my orange slightly. And then what I'm going to do is actually kind of bring some on top of this little area. It's watered down so you can see through it, but I'm kind of adding the orange in. You could also use, this is where I use glazing medium a lot. But for this, I'm just using a little water. Just kind of gives that see-through kind of light effect. And you could definitely add that in some other areas if you wanted to. Even over the brown, like it just seems kind of like maybe there's a bit of warmth. You want to take a bit of your watered down red or magenta or orange and kind of glaze it over top of some of these dried colors just to give them a bit of, again, kind of warmth. You can also do that at the very end too and just kind of wait till your whole painting is done and then do a few of those, because I'll probably glaze a little bit on the cat itself too. It just allows you to get a bit of that brighter kind of glow. And you can see kind of how when the orange goes over top of the dark, it almost starts to create some of those little color mixes that we see. And I do have some just negative space here. I'm just going to work a little orange into some of these spaces. I kind of muted it slightly, but just to pull some more orange around. And then we'll get some orange in the cat, especially coming down through here, which will pull this orange down and around. I think that'll look nice. I am going to also, though, kind of work some of the dark in here too. I don't want this corner too bright. But I want little pops of orange in there. So again, I'm kind of making this up. It's not exactly what I'm seeing at this point. It's just kind of a suggestion of it. But to me, that's problem solving. That's painting sometimes too, is kind of working out some of that other stuff. I'll be here for just a couple more minutes and then maybe talk a little bit about starting on the cat today too. And then up here, when this is dry, now I can glaze up there and make that not look like bam bam to just like stuck on pieces, right? But what I can do, if I water down my neutral, my dark neutral, so that was my burnt umber plus my phthalo, sorry, my raw umber. I keep doing that to you guys. My raw umber, this one. Raw umber plus phthalo blue. I'm adding a little water to that. Then what I can start doing is with that watered down neutral, I can start bringing it over top of the edges of the orange. As long as it's watered down, I can still see it. You can see the orange poke through. As long as the orange is dry. This is a wet on dry technique that we're doing, if you choose to do this. But in my opinion, that's how you can kind of get the orange to kind of push back while still being visible. And if we would have done the orange on top of the dark, it would have turned out like this over here. It wouldn't have been as bright. So in order to get that brightness, we kind of needed to do that first. And so what I'm going to do now with that little bit of neutral is just kind of pop in a few little dark areas where I see it. Because some of that orange is still vibrant and really bright, but then some of it kind of is in a little bit more of a shadow. So watered down, again, raw umber plus phthalo blue is what I'm using. I can just kind of glaze that over top wherever I want to. And then if there's edges that are funky or anything, I can always grab some not watered down neutral and always come back in and kind of redefine edges a little bit more too. Sometimes that happens. It's okay to go back in and use the opposite color to kind of reconfigure the shape. I just don't want my edges to be like so sharp. That's kind of what I want to get rid of. And then honestly, as I'm looking at it, I'm like, oh, maybe it's still a little too bright. So sometimes what I do is I let my first layer of glaze dry, then I might do a second layer of glaze. And I could also, on top of the dark, glaze in some orange again too, you know? So you can like build layers of glazes. Glazes are just, the idea behind them is they're see-through. So you can kind of keep building up the layers underneath. Okay, I don't want to spend too much more time on the background for now, at least. I can always come back to it. I'm going to do a couple more little things just to kind of refine some of these little edges. Just kind of build it up a little bit more. And I'm just kind of allowing my paint to be a little kind of swirly and just kind of move it around. And I think I might stop with it for there. So again, it's not exact, not at all, but it, I think, is going to push back when I get the cat painted and defined. And if it doesn't push back as much as I want it to, I can go back in and add some other things. So with the cat, we've got a little bit of time still to keep going here. So let's talk about the cat a little bit. I know we had some folks join us too as we got going. So if you're just joining us or joined us a little bit ago, welcome in. It's great to have you. We are working on this cat for 2 more weeks after today. So we got some time on it to develop it. Started by blocking in the background, and I did kind of an orangish magenta plus yellow wash. And yeah, so I'm gonna leave the background like that for now, again, just so I can focus on the cat and make sure I give enough time for that. So as far as the cat goes, there is multiple places we could start. I actually thought it might be kind of fun to start with the eye and get the eye in there and then start kind of building out around the head into the part of the body we do see, and then maybe finish out with that little butterfly, which will be a nice finishing touch. So I thought I'm going to zoom in a little with that eye. And let me show you the eye zoomed in on my tablet really quickly. like we got kind of a yellow greenish color, but we do have a little bit of kind of warmth coming around it. So I'm actually going to start the eye with my neutral, which is my raw umber plus phthalo blue. And I'm going to start kind of defining the dark around the eye. I'm not going to worry about that little bit of warmth just yet. And again, eyes, it's not like you have to paint them exactly as they are, just like anything else. You know, you can interpret them. But let me go ahead and grab one of my little brushes a minute. Good to get some little detail brushes if you've got them for these little spots. So I'll kind of show you. I've got a few little round ones. The one I'm going to be using is 2/0. A little hard to see. Just a little round guy. Just so it's such a tiny spot. This is one spot though, like even though I didn't pull black on my palette, oftentimes I do like a little black in the eye because it really defines it. But you know, you don't have to. So what I'm going to start by doing is just taking a little bit of paint on this little tiny brush, and I'm going to start by blocking in the dark that I see going around the eye. And I find with these little spots, I have to just like reload my brush quite often, honestly. Especially if I want it to look pretty clean. And of course, you can always add a little water or medium to help the fluidity. But if you just keep reloading your brush with fresh paint, that can also work. I'm just looking at where the shadows hit on the eye, where all those kind of dark lines and edges are. Sometimes when you don't paint the eye on an animal like the cat and you start painting the fur, it can look silly for a long time actually. Once you get that eye in there, it's like a game changer. And so I thought, well, maybe let's start with it. I do notice too, we get a little bit of kind of that triangular. I mean, folks who have cats or, you know, been around cats, you kind of know they have that little part that kind of comes in a little bit there. And then I notice it kind of gets a little browner as it goes out. So if I wanted to, I could add a little bit of more raw umber versus the blue, just to add a little bit more brown. I'm just kind of bringing that little shape out that I see. All right, so the color of the eye itself, oh, it's so pretty. There's little greens in there, and the reflections in this eye, if you get real close, are actually that light blue. There is a bit of white, but the highlights in there are kind of a blue, which I think is fun. And we'll pull the blue from around here into the eye, which, you know, makes sense. Oftentimes reflections are from what's around us. So I'm just cleaning off my brush a little, but I'm going to use the same brush. And to make a green, since I don't have green on my palette, I will be mixing it with yellow plus blue. Now I could try my light blue and see if that gets a green I like. My light blue is actually going to give me a pretty bright green, so I may do a little bit of my phthalo blue. But then I might add a little extra yellow and white to that green. And if the green is too intense, try adding a dot of your red to it or your magenta, a tiny dot. If that didn't do the trick, try another tiny dot. Okay, I think I've got my color here now. I'm kind of taking a bit of kind of greenish, yellow greenish that I made. And when I look closely at the eye, this color is not everywhere in the eye. There's other colors. So I know it's hard to see a little bit, but what I'm trying to do is paint the green in just the little spaces I see them. Now, yes, you could paint it green and then bring other colors in around it or on top of it, you could, but I kind of like to just paint where the little shapes are because that helps me learn how to see the shapes better because I'm actually practicing my observational skills while I'm doing it this way. So, and that's personally something I like to get better at, grow at. Just, I think the better you see, even if you're not drawing or painting hyper realistically, it allows you to make better interpretations. Just putting in a few little pops. Then I notice there's some spots where it feels even a little bit more yellowy. So I could take a little bit more yellow, bring some of that into some areas. I just kind of tap them in. It's not exact. As with all of this, it's not exact. Approximation. And I didn't put the pupil in yet too. I'll get that in just a second. Sometimes it looks a little off until you get the pupil in, and then once the highlights come in, it's like, whoa. So I'm gonna put the pupil in just a second, and then I do want to put little bits of orange in the eye too. I'm gonna go back to my neutral a minute, my dark neutral. And I'm gonna go ahead and use that for the pupil. And to me, it's getting as dark as I need it to, so I don't think I'm gonna need to add any black into my painting at all. Reading nice and dark how I want it to, so. I notice the bottom of the pupil goes down to the bottom of the eye, but up at the top, there's space. And if you make your pupil too big or too whatever, use some of your green or eye color to clean it back up. Then this is where I'm going to get a little orange into it. And then I'll put a few little highlights in there. And I might kind of check in, see how everyone's feeling, and we might save the rest for next time. I'm just using a little of the orange that I used for up here. And in my opinion, I feel like I see up at the top of the eye, against where the green and the black part meet, I feel like I see a bit of orange. A little water, I think, can be helpful for this part. You don't have to, but I'm gonna put just a little bit of water in. A small little spot, and I don't want it to be too harsh of a line. That's why sometimes I like a little water for that. But then basically what I'll do is just kind of fill in the orange when I see it. Then I'll just come in and fill in any gaps with some green. And then I'm going to be putting in the highlights in a minute. I think this cat fur is going to teach us a lot. It's going to teach us a lot of skills that'll be transferable to other animals. And just this idea of painting something that's white, you know, is it actually white? So that's going to be fun to look at that a little bit more too. I'm going to go ahead and just, I still don't love what my pupil looks like in the cat, so I'm just taking a little bit more of my neutral. I just want it to kind of round out a little bit more as it comes down. You know, the pupil's really skinny in this picture, but I just want to be able to see a little bit of that in mine. So I like that better. So the last thing I think I'll do, actually we might have a little bit more time, but the last thing on the eye for what I'm going to do is just a little bit of highlight. And again, I'm going to play with a blue highlight. So I like a little white, a little blue. I'm just using my light blue, but if you're using your darker blue, you'll probably want to start with white and add a bit of blue into it. And still using my little tiny brush, what I'm going to start doing is just looking at these little spots where I see some little light blue highlights. And again, they don't need to be exact. And then as I look closer, I see little orange highlights and little this and that. It's, you know, there's a lot happening in an eye. It's so reflective. So it just catches all these little lights and you can see all the little bits of background color we used in the eye. Again, you do not need to get as detailed if you don't want to. There's such a range of how you want to interpret this. You could just pick a couple little highlights and pop those in. You can do more highlights. It's all up to you. I'm going to put a couple little orange highlights in, a little like more circular shape, and call it done for now with the eye. If I want to come back and refine it, I can, but I want to start building around the eye next.
Jennifer, could you zoom in on that?
Yeah, here, I'll hold it up a little. I think that helps. So there's a lot of little green in there, a couple little swipes of orange going across the top, one coming down. You see the pupil in there, and then I just kind of put those little light blue bits on top. But to be honest, I might even come back in with a little bit more green, because sometimes I'm like, oh, actually it looks a little too much, or so sometimes I do come back in with the main eye color and just add a little bit more. You can always go back and forth with it if you need to. This painting this little stuff sometimes is a little tricky. So that's why I think if you simplify, it's totally fine. It's just, you know, the more detail you add, we've talked about this, the more rendered it looks, which often translates into a little bit more realistic. Not always, it just depends, but.
Oh, yeah. Whoa.
And some of that orange in there is like almost neonish, which I don't have a neon orange like that. I know Blick makes one, or sorry, not Blick, Liquitex makes one. I don't happen to have it, so I'm not gonna worry about getting that right. I think I'm gonna go ahead and stop the eye there. So I know we're close on time here, which I'll pause in a minute just in case anyone has questions or, you know, anything they wanna kind of mention before we take off. But where I'm heading next, I want to pull this back a little bit now. A little bit more. So I think, you know, it being unfinished still, you know, you look at the eye and you kind of question a little bit. But now as I start building around the eye, that's going to help. But I can also at any point in time, you know, adjust anything I want to. Still like a little unsure about the pupil in mine, but we'll see. I can always add a bit more. darken it, you know, I can kind of rework it. But my next thing is I want to start building kind of around the eye and start blocking in the cat. Now, there is a lot of fur. It can feel overwhelming when we're trying to paint something like this. So a lot of times I squint, I'll squint at it. And if you look at like the white fur, for example, when you squint, all of a sudden you start to notice the darker spots more. And to me, dark, well, this is not just to me, but this is a thing. Dark values go back in space, light values pop forward. So just like it made sense to paint the background first because the fur was going to pop over top, it makes sense to me to paint darks first because lights pop on top. And so if we start blocking in our dark values first, we can start to define the cat and start to make sense of it. So I kind of think we should group it into maybe a couple areas. I think we should look at kind of the head a little bit, just because we have some different kind of fur going through here. And then we'll kind of look at the body and getting kind of this part in. Then we'll finish with all these little details like the whiskers and maybe finishing touches on the butterfly and things like that. So that was kind of my thought of direction of where we're headed. So while we still have a couple minutes, I'll just show you kind of what that starts to look like up by the head. While I have some of my dark neutral, again, that's raw umber and phthalo blue for me, whatever your dark neutral is. If you mix some of that up, there's a couple ways we can look at this. When I look up here and I squint, to me, this reads as almost solid. Almost. There's a couple areas like that too. There's a bit of area on the nose that feels more solid, almost like that spot around the eye did. So sometimes what I like to do to get started with is I start with the places that feel kind of solid. So if they feel kind of solid, I paint them more as bigger shapes. I'll just kind of show you a little bit. I'm taking my dark neutral and I'm just using a number 6 round, and I'm just starting to fill in the areas that feel a little bit, like I said, they're not completely solid blocks of color, but they read as a bit more solid. Because if I put those areas in, that gives my eye a place to look, to see, and then to start building more. So that's my thought process of why I go kind of that route. Now, I do like to mention this a lot, that painting is highly subjective, and that goes with the order and the process of things too. So the way I do it is just but one. You know, you might find you want to go about it in a different way. But I just like to start getting areas in that I can kind of use as grounding points. And if I get those big blocks in, it helps me fill in the gaps easier. That's why I kind of like to paint this way. And yes, I do notice some warmth in here with the light coming down, but I plan on glazing more of that in, that watered down application of paint over top. Because really, think of it this way. The cat's fur is not orangey. It's the light that's doing that, the light being cast. So if I paint the cat kind of the colors it seems like the cat is and glaze on the oranginess, then the natural colors will poke through, much like what's happening in the picture. However, there are techniques where you could just start infusing those colors into this too, and that would look, I think, really awesome. So I always like to mention there's just multiple ways to do things. And to me, that's the fun part, is you get to choose. What do you want to do for yours? And I'll try to talk about different approaches because of that. But again, feel free to experiment, because if you're using acrylic is pretty forgiving in the sense that you can cover things up and paint over it. It's challenging, no doubt, but it's forgivable. So that's kind of what I mean by like that block of area. And if I squint at the picture and look and squint at mine, I'm like, oh yeah, I can kind of see where that shape is coming from. And there's more of that too. You see a bit down here near the mouth of that. So that's kind of what I do when I'm blocking in, especially starting a new part. I think, where are these dark spots? Where can I start blocking in some dark so I can start to see? Some people like to start mid-tone value. That's great too. I think it's rare someone starts with light lights in an acrylic, but there's always exceptions depending on what you're painting, and people do things differently. But I always like to say this, the darks to me give definition. They help me see contrast. And to me, seeing is crucial. If I can start seeing where things go, I can start making this look like the cat. So I'm doing the same thing on the nose, just kind of looking at where does it read as kind of solid-ish. It's not, it doesn't have to be totally solid, but kind of solid-ish. Then maybe I'm going to start by painting that spot. Again, direction, in my opinion, is important here. Kind of how I followed the angle here, but when I start painting, let's say over here, I might start thinking about moving my brush kind of down and over. And some of these little white fur bits that come across, I'm going to do that later. Because I'm using acrylic, light will sit on top of dark, no problem. I'm more concerned about painting what's underneath first. The stuff that sits on top can sit on top. And I just use the tip of my brush kind of and just start to pull out some lines to start to suggest some of the fur that we're seeing. Some of it's a little transparent, but that's okay, it can build. But I'm gonna go ahead and stop for now. I think that's an okay stopping point. There's so much more. I think this is gonna be really fun. I think it's gonna come together nicely. But I will tell you, next week we're gonna really get into the ugly face. Just for a bit though, just for a bit. I think that because we painted the eye, it's gonna help with the ugly face. The ugly face, when the eye's not painted, it's always like, when an eye has nothing there, it's just a little, oh, interesting. But yeah, so again, just to kind of recap where we're headed next week, I'm going to continue where I left off, blocking in some of these darks and starting to bring around the head. And then I'll start to show you how to add in some of the light values in the head, and we'll really get some nice definition, especially those really fluffy cats. There's so much fur. So when you start to get that definition, it's going to help, especially around this neck area. And then we'll move into the body. And then my thought is probably on our final week for the painting, the 18th, we'll wrap up with those small details. If we hadn't gotten to the butterfly yet, we'll do the butterfly. We'll do the little whiskers. We'll fine tune things. We'll reassess the background now that the cat's done. Is there anything we want to change? Because I think you'll really get a sense of your background when your cat is finished. And then you'll know if you want to do something else to it. So there we go. Good start. I think this is a fun one. I'm excited for it. But I do want to pause just for a minute. We have a few extra minutes here, so I'm going to take off my spotlight.